The sun had not yet cleared the Chesapeake when Claire Merritt began her first mile. 5:47 in the morning, march. The kind of march that hadn't decided yet whether it was still winter, the air sharp enough to cut the ground hard beneath her boots, frost still clinging to the grass along the edge of the track, like something that refused to let go. She ran alone. She always ran alone at this hour, not because no one else was awake. This was Annapolis. This was the United States Naval Academy, and men and women here were trained to rise before the sun had the decency to show up. She ran alone because this hour belonged to her. This was the 37 minutes each morning when no one needed anything from her, when no cadet called out her rank, when no memo sat waiting on her desk. 37 minutes of nothing but the track and the cold and the sound of her own breathing. And her right leg. Most people wouldn't notice it if they weren't looking. A slight drag on the push-off. A fraction of a second's delay between the left stride and the right. Nothing that slowed her down in any meaningful way, at least not in any way she would ever acknowledge out loud. But it was there every morning, a quiet reminder of a morning 4 years ago in Kandahar, when the ground had decided it was done being solid. She had learned to run through it. She had learned to run through most things. Claire was 28 years old and had the kind of face that made people guess younger until they looked at her eyes. Her eyes were older than the rest of her. Not tired, not defeated, just experienced in a way that certain kinds of living tend to produce. She had short, dark hair that she kept practical, not by regulation, but by preference, in a posture that was less military rigidity and more the natural uprightness of someone who simply didn't see the point in slouching. She was, by any honest measurement, the finest hand-to-hand combat instructor the Naval Academy had seen in over a decade. Her cadets routinely outperformed graduates from every other program in the building. 3 of them had gone on to special operations assignments in the last 18 months alone. Her evaluations were so consistently excellent that the review board had stopped reading them carefully because there was never anything surprising in them. She was simply that good, and everyone knew it, and she had never once used that fact as a weapon. There were mornings when the leg reminded her more than others. This was one of them. The cold had gotten into the old injury the way cold does, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with the patient persistence of something that knows it has the advantage of time. She adjusted her stride by a fraction, the way she had learned to adjust it, and she kept going. This was what most people did not understand about her. The people who watched her move through the academy and saw only the fluency and the precision and the quiet authority of someone who has mastered their environment. They did not see the negotiation. The daily private, non-negotiable negotiation between what the body could still do and what the will required of it. She did not speak of it because there was nothing useful to say. The leg was what it was. Every morning she got up and did the math and came to the same conclusion forward. She had been doing that math since November of 2015 in a field hospital outside Kandahar, and she had never once arrived at a different answer. She was halfway through her 3rd lap when she saw the figure sitting outside the gate to the training compound. She almost didn't stop. At 5:47 in the morning, the figure outside a gate at a military academy could mean 100 things, and most of them were not her business. She slowed anyway. Something about the posture, the particular geometry of someone trying to make themselves smaller than they were, caught at something in her chest. She stopped. Cadet Sylvie Marlowe was 22 years old, and she was sitting on the cold concrete with her back against the chain-link fence, her knees pulled up, her uniform jacket wrapped around her shoulders against the March chill. She was holding something in both hands. When Claire got close enough to see what it was, she felt the familiar weight of a specific kind of anger settle into her stomach. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply takes up residence and doesn't leave. It was a complaint form, standard Naval Academy internal grievance document, and it had been torn in half, not crumpled, not dropped, torn, deliberately cleanly with the particular intention of someone who wanted the person who had filled it out to understand something. Marlowe's left cheekbone carried a bruise that was still developing, purple at the center, yellowing at the edges, the kind that happens when something lands flush. Her lip was split on the right side. She had clearly been crying and had clearly stopped, and was now somewhere past crying in that flat, exhausted country that exists on the other side of it. She looked up when Claire crouched down in front of her, and she didn't look surprised. She looked like someone who had been waiting without knowing who she was waiting for. Claire didn't say anything immediately. She looked at the torn form and at the bruise and at the girl's eyes, and she let the silence do the work it needed to do. "I fell," Marlowe said. "You don't have to say anything right now," Claire said. "That's what I'm supposed to say. That I fell." "I know." Marlowe looked at her for a long moment. You're Lieutenant Merritt. Yes. You trained my father, Sergeant First Class Marlowe, Fort Liberty 2014 before he... She stopped, looked away, before he was medically separated. Claire remembered him. Broad shoulders, quiet voice, the kind of man who listened twice as much as he spoke. He'd had a bad knee from Fallujah and a worse attitude about accepting help, which Claire had always considered one of his more admirable qualities. I remember him, she said. He was a good man. He still is, Marlowe said, with just enough edge to make the correction matter. He still is, Claire agreed. She helped Marlowe to her feet, and she held on to the two pieces of the torn complaint form, and she filed them carefully into the inside pocket of her jacket. And she said nothing more about it because this was not the time for questions or plans or any kind of action. This was the time for a cup of coffee from the mess hall and a walk back to the barracks and the simple human act of making sure someone who had been knocked down made it back inside under their own power. But the anger stayed. It had been there before, if she was honest with herself. For weeks, maybe longer, in the low-grade background way that certain truths build up before you're ready to name them. She had noticed things. The cadet who had filed a formal complaint in January and quietly withdrawn it 2 weeks later with no explanation and eyes that looked at the floor whenever senior staff walked by. The senior instructor who had mentioned carefully and in passing that a pattern seemed to be developing and then mentioned it only once and never again. The silence that certain people went into when Admiral Warren Gault's name came up in conversation, not the respectful silence of subordinates, but the careful silence of people who had learned something and decided that what they had learned was safer unspoken. Gault had been commandant of the academy for 3 years. He was 58 years old, compact and precise in the way of a man who had spent his entire career making sure every surface he presented to the world was immaculate. Silver hair always cut to the same length, dress uniform without a single thread out of place, a handshake that was exactly as firm as protocol required and never more. He spoke in complete sentences and never appeared flustered and was never ever seen to raise his voice. He was also, Claire had come to understand, the kind of man who had simply learned to perform his cruelty quietly. She had no proof of that yet. What she had was the torn form in her jacket pocket and the bruise on Marlowe's face and the slow accumulation of small things that didn't add up when you laid them next to each other. She had the instinct of someone who had been trained to read environments, to notice the texture of a space, to understand when the ground beneath her feet was not what it appeared to be, and she had been trained to trust that instinct. She found Master Chief Desmond Firth in the equipment room at the end of the West Quarter 2 hours later. He was doing what he always did in the early morning hours, working through the inventory with the methodical patience of a man who had learned long ago that the smallest details were usually the most important ones. Firth was 67 years old, lean, in the way that decades of physical discipline produce, with hands so thoroughly calloused, they looked like something a sculptor had made from leather. His hair had gone white sometime in his 50s, and he had never appeared to notice or care. He had been at the academy for 6 years. Before that, he had been many things in many places, most of them the kind of places that don't appear on the briefing maps shown to the general public. He had been at the Marine Barracks in Beirut in October of 1983, which meant he had been 21 years old when the world came down at 6:22 in the morning, and he had lived through something that 141 of his fellow Marines had not. He had never spoken about it in any detail to anyone at the academy. He had spoken about it once to Claire. That had been 3 years ago in this same room late in the evening, after everyone else had gone, when something in a training drill had cracked something open that neither of them had been prepared for. He had told her about the weight, the particular specific weight of being the one who walks out. She had listened without interrupting, which was apparently what he had needed, because afterward he had simply nodded at her and gone back to his inventory, and they had never discussed it again. But something had changed between them that evening, a kind of recognition that does not require words or explanation. He looked up when she came in. He read her face in about half a second. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. He set down his clipboard and turned to face her fully. "How bad?" "Marlowe, first-year cadet, bruising on the face, split lip, complaint form torn in half." Firth was quiet for a moment. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It simply deepened the way a river looks different when you realize how far down the bottom actually is. "Fifth one," he said. It wasn't a question, but something in the way he said it made her stop. "You've been counting." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she understood this was a decision he was making right now in real time. "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said. She sat. What he told her took 40 minutes, and he told it without drama or emphasis, in the same measured voice he used to go through equipment inventories. He told her about November of 2017, a training exercise that had gone wrong, not catastrophically, not in the explosive way that lands on the front page of anything, but in the quiet, preventable way that happens when the people responsible for safety have been replaced by the people responsible for appearances. A cadet named Thomas Breck, 20 years old from a small town in central Ohio who had suffered a medical event during a high-stress water training drill that had not been properly supervised, who had been pulled from the water, who had been taken not to the infirmary, but to an office, who had died 47 minutes later in a building that did not have the equipment to handle what had happened to him. Firth had been there. He had seen the boy carried out of the water. He had seen the decision made, who made it how quickly, with what complete lack of hesitation to manage the situation, rather than address it. He had seen the report that came out 2 weeks later, which described a training accident with procedural anomalies that had since been corrected. He had been asked by someone whose rank he respected to confirm that the revised report was accurate. He had confirmed it. He stopped talking. The room was very quiet. "You signed off on a false report," Claire said. "Not as an accusation, as a statement of fact that required acknowledgement before they could move forward." "I did," Firth said. "I was told that making it public would destroy the careers of 3 good officers who had nothing to do with the decision that killed that boy, and that the family had been notified and compensated, and that the procedures had actually been corrected," which was true. "I told myself the damage was done and the living still needed protecting." He paused. "I've had 2 years to think about whether I was right." "And I was not right," he said. "I was afraid, and I dressed it up as pragmatism, and it was not right." She looked at him. The white hair, the calloused hands, the eyes of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had made his peace with the weight of it without ever pretending it wasn't there. "Why are you telling me this now?" He reached into the inside pocket of his utility jacket and produced a small flash drive, the kind so unremarkable it could have been anything. He held it in his palm for a moment before placing it on the table between them. "Because I've been collecting things," he said, "for 18 months, since the second complaint was filed and withdrawn. Since I understood that 2017 was not an isolated failure of judgment, but the beginning of a pattern." He looked at the drive. "The original report is on there, the revised version. A comparison with the discrepancies marked. 3 separate incident logs I kept personally dated and time-stamped. Names." He looked up at her. "I'm not going to be here forever, Lieutenant. I got a diagnosis in November. 6 months, give or take, which means I have somewhere between nothing left to lose and everything left to give." Claire was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, a formation of cadets crossed the quad in the early morning light, their breath visible in the cold air, their boots hitting the ground in the specific rhythm of people learning to move together. "Why me?" she said finally. Firth almost smiled. "Because you're the only person in this building who scares me slightly less than Gault does," he said. "And because you're the only person I've watched go through pain every single morning for 3 years and never once use it as an excuse for anything." She looked at the drive. She did not pick it up yet. "I need to know something first," she said. "The boy in 2017, Thomas Breck, his family. His mother was told it was a training accident. She was given a settlement. She signed a non-disclosure agreement." Firth's voice was level. "She lives in Mansfield, Ohio. She has a photograph of her son in his dress uniform on her kitchen table. I know because I went there last August. I sat in her kitchen and I drank her coffee and I looked at that photograph and I told her I had served with men of Thomas's character and that he had been remarkable." He stopped. "It was the most truthful thing I said in that entire conversation." Claire picked up the drive. She turned it over in her fingers, once feeling the weight of it, which was almost nothing physically, which was the kind of irony that the universe tends not to bother apologizing for. "I'm going to need more than this," she said. "This is the foundation. I need corroboration, witnesses, current evidence." "I know. Gault is going to see me coming." "He already has," Firth said, and the way he said it made her go still. "What do you mean?" Firth picked up his clipboard not because he needed to look at it, but because it was something to hold. "You've been asking questions, Lieutenant. Quietly, carefully, the way you do everything, but you've been asking them. Gault has people who tell him things. He has been aware of your interest for at least 2 weeks." She absorbed this, rearranged the pieces she had been assembling. "He's going to move before I do." "Yes." "How much time do I have?" Firth looked at her steadily. "Enough," he said, "if you don't waste any of it." She did not waste any of it. She spent the rest of that morning working through her normal schedule, 2 training sessions, a review meeting with second-year cadets, a logistics briefing that she sat through with her full attention while running a separate thread of calculation in the back of her mind. She gave nothing away in her posture, her expression, or her voice. She had learned in Kandahar that the most dangerous thing you could do in hostile territory was let the territory know you understood it was hostile. But at 1400 hours, when she returned from the logistics briefing to find a transfer order waiting on her desk, she understood that Firth had underestimated the timeline. The order was signed by Admiral Gault. It was dated that morning. Effective immediately, Lieutenant Claire Merritt was being reassigned from her position as primary combat training instructor to a desk posting in the Curriculum Review Division, a position that was in institutional terms the equivalent of being quietly placed in a room and asked to stay there. The official reason: program restructuring. She read it twice. Then she set it down on her desk and sat back and looked at the ceiling for exactly 90 seconds. He had been watching her. He had been waiting for the right moment to cut her legs out from under her before she had any ground to stand on. The Marlowe situation had accelerated his timeline. He knew she had found the girl, knew she had seen the form, knew the morning run was going to become something more. And so he had moved, efficiently, cleanly, through proper channels, with a reason that was just plausible enough to resist a direct challenge. He was not just telling her that he had the power to move her, he was telling her that he had been a step ahead of her from the beginning, that the board was already set, that she was a piece being managed, not a player making moves. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she thought about Desmond Firth sitting in a kitchen in Mansfield, Ohio, drinking coffee and looking at a photograph of a 20-year-old boy in a dress uniform. She thought about Sylvie Marlowe sitting on cold concrete at 5:47 in the morning, holding the torn halves of a complaint that someone had decided didn't deserve to exist. She thought about Thomas Breck, who had been pulled from a pool in November of 2017 and had died 47 minutes later in a building that was not equipped to save him and whose mother had signed a piece of paper that she probably did not fully understand. Claire Merritt stood up from her desk. She picked up the transfer order. She folded it once precisely along the center line. She placed it in the same jacket pocket where she kept the torn complaint form. Then she went to find Sylvie Marlowe. The sun was already lower in the sky by the time she crossed the quad, the March light going golden and flat, cadets moving in every direction, with the focused energy of people who had somewhere to be. She moved through them without hurrying, her right leg pulled slightly on each stride. She had been told in a hospital in Germany in November of 2015 that she would probably never run again at any meaningful pace. The doctor had been kind about it. Professional. He had explained the structural damage with charts and patience, and had clearly expected her to cry or rage or do something that acknowledged the magnitude of what she was being told. She had thanked him for his time and asked when physical therapy started. Iron does not bend. It remembers every blow. It carries every scar forward. It does not forget, and it does not soften, and it does not make peace with the things that deserve no peace. But it also does not break. She found Marlowe in the library at a table in the back corner, staring at a textbook that she was clearly not reading. The girl looked up when Claire sat down across from her, and something shifted in her expression, a fractional loosening of the careful control that young people in difficult situations learn to maintain in public. Claire placed the 2 pieces of the torn complaint form on the table between them. "Tell me everything," she said. "From the beginning, all of it. Take as long as you need." Marlowe looked at the torn form. Then she looked at Claire. Then she began to talk. She was not an easy talker, not the kind of person who has been waiting for permission and then produces everything in a rush. She was precise and careful, and she chose her words with the attention of someone who has learned recently and painfully that words can be used against you. She described each incident in sequence, backtracking when she remembered a detail she had left out, stopping when she needed to, resuming when she was ready. Claire did not prompt her, did not fill the silences, did not write anything down. What emerged over this course of 2 hours was not a story of dramatic violence or overt abuse. It was something more insidious than that, which in some ways made it worse. It was the story of a system working exactly as it had been designed to work, the careful, patient application of institutional pressure to a single point of vulnerability until the point gave way. Questions designed to locate weakness, presence designed to intimidate. And when intimidation proved insufficient, something more direct, always calibrated, always deniable, always operating just inside the boundary of what could be formally characterized as misconduct by someone who had never in his career been successfully characterized as anything. That was what made Gault extraordinary at what he did. Not the cruelty was common enough, the precision, the understanding of exactly how much force was required and in what form and at what moment to produce the desired outcome without leaving a mark that could be pointed to and named. 5 times in 2 years, each time the desired outcome had been achieved. The complaint withdrawn, the voice silenced, the machinery continuing, until it didn't. Claire walked her back to the barracks at 21:45. The next 5 days moved in the rhythm of a person doing 2 things simultaneously. She did not make promises she could not keep. She did not tell Marlowe that everything was going to be all right because she did not know that yet, and because Marlowe was the daughter of a soldier and would not have believed it anyway. What she said at the door to the barracks was this: "You filed that complaint. That is on record somewhere regardless of what someone did with the paper copy. Your account exists. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't." Marlowe looked at her. "Is that enough?" "Not yet," Claire said, "but it's the beginning." She walked back across the quad in the dark, and the anger that had settled into her stomach that morning had not gone anywhere. It had simply organized itself, clarified, become something more useful than feeling. She had work to do. Outside the library windows, the March sky over Annapolis had gone the color of old iron gray and dense, and carrying the weight of weather still to come. The water was out there somewhere past the buildings, patient and old, older than any of this, running its own schedule regardless of what human institutions decided to do with their days. And the fracture line that had been forming for 2 years, the one that ran beneath the polished floors and the immaculate uniforms and the precisely worded reports, ran a little further, performing the surface of their normal life while building something underneath it. On the surface, Claire reported to the Curriculum Review Division each morning, sat at the desk that had been assigned to her, and worked through the administrative material she had been given with complete professional attention. She asked no provocative questions, made no visible objections, and gave every supervisor she encountered the impression of a woman who had accepted her reassignment with the equanimity of someone who understood how institutions worked. Underneath, she was pulling threads. The flash drive Firth had given her was the foundation, and she had spent the first night going through it with the careful attention of someone who understood that the difference between evidence and information is corroboration. The original training report from November 2017 was there, and it was specific, and the discrepancies between it and the revised version were not subtle once you knew where to look. 3 data points in the safety assessment. A timestamp on the medical response log that had been moved back by 11 minutes in the revised version. 11 minutes that, if the original was accurate, meant the decision to delay calling the base infirmary had been made deliberately by someone who understood exactly what that delay would cost. The name on the original authorization log was Gault's, not an aide, not a subordinate acting on implied instruction. Gault himself signing off on the containment protocol that had turned a medical emergency into a managed narrative. She looked at that signature for a long time. Then she started on the secondary corroboration. Firth had included the names of 4 former cadets in his files, the 4 who had filed complaints in the 18 months prior to Marlowe, all of which had been withdrawn. He had contact information for 2 of them. The other 2 had left the academy entirely and dropped from any trackable institutional record, which was its own kind of information. She reached the first one on the second day. A former cadet named Preston Hale, who had left the academy in the spring of 2018 and was now working as a civilian contractor at a naval facility in Virginia. She called him from a personal phone off campus during her lunch break. She introduced herself and explained that she understood he had signed documentation when he left and that she was not asking him to violate any agreement. She was asking only whether the shape of what she believed had happened was accurate. He was quiet for a long time. She could hear his breathing on the line and the background sounds of wherever he was in office, probably somewhere with the low hum of ventilation and the distant sound of keyboards. She understood what he was weighing. He had built something in the years since he had left the academy. A job, a degree of stability, a life in which the thing that had happened at Annapolis was a door he had closed and was doing his best not to open again. She was asking him to crack it. She waited and did not fill the silence because filling it would have been a form of pressure, and she had promised herself she would not do that. Then he said, "Yes." 1 word, nothing more. She did not push him, and they ended the call. It was not testimony, it was not anything she could put in front of a review board, but it was confirmation of the shape of the thing, and the shape of the thing was what she needed to understand before she could build anything from the details. The second name on the list was a woman named Geraldine Thorne, who had filed a complaint in the fall of 2018 and withdrawn it 6 weeks later. Thorne was still at the academy she had not left, which was either remarkable courage or the specific calculus of someone who had decided that leaving would mean letting a thing win. Claire found her in the officers' gym on the third evening, and she sat down on the bench next to her, and she said nothing for a while. And then she said, "I know what you signed. I'm not here about that." Thorne looked straight ahead. "Then what are you here about?" "I'm here because there's going to be a fifth person." "There already is. And if there's a fifth, there's going to be a sixth." Thorne was quiet. Her jaw was set in the way of a person actively maintaining control of something. "You can't protect me," she said. "I know," Claire said. "I'm not offering to protect you. I'm asking you to consider whether there's something you're willing to say on your own terms at a time of your choosing to the right people." "And who are the right people?" "That depends on what you decide, but I'm working on it." Thorne didn't answer, but she also didn't leave. And when Claire stood up to go, Thorne said quietly to the wall in front of her, "The report on Breck. There were 4 people in that room when the decision was made. I was not one of them, but I know the names of 2 who were, so Claire stopped. "I'll think about it," Thorne said. "That's all I'm telling you right now." "That's enough," Claire said. She meant it. In her experience, "I'll think about it" from a person who had every reason to say nothing at all was not a deflection. It was a door left open by a fraction of an inch by someone who was not yet sure they wanted to walk through it, but who had not yet decided to close it either. You did not force those doors. You noted their position, and you kept working, and you trusted that the person on the other side was doing their own reckoning in their own time. On the 4th day, she found the camera footage. It had taken her 2 evenings of careful work through the administrative access logs from her curriculum review posting, which gave her reach into scheduling and facility systems she could justify accessing for curriculum coordination purposes to identify which corridor cameras had coverage of the path between Admiral Gault's office suite and the East Wing barracks. There were 3 cameras on that route. 2 had experienced system failures in January. The 3rd had not. She located its archive through the facilities management database and reviewed the relevant timestamps. The footage showed at 21:14 on the evening of March 3rd, Admiral Gault walking alone down the east corridor toward the first-year barracks. Civilian dress, no aide, nothing in his hands. His official schedule for that evening, which she cross-referenced through the command calendar, showed him attending a command dinner off campus from 1900 to 22:30. He had not been at the dinner. He had been in that corridor. Marlowe had described the 3rd incident as occurring on the evening of March 3rd in the East Corridor by a person whose face and rank she had identified clearly. She backed up the footage 3 times to 3 separate locations she controlled. She was back at her desk in the curriculum review office by 0800 the next morning, reviewing a syllabus document with the full appearance of a woman whose entire world was this desk and these papers. She was almost satisfied with what she had. Almost. She stopped at the window of the curriculum review office on the evening of the 3rd day looking out at the track, and she let herself go back to Kandahar for the first time in a while. She did not often do this deliberately. The memory was there when it wanted to be there, and she had learned to work alongside to it rather than either toward or away from it. But there were moments when going back was useful not for comfort, which it did not provide, but for calibration, for the reminder of what she already knew she was capable of surviving. September 2015. A routine reconnaissance patrol in a valley that had been quiet for 3 weeks, which in Afghanistan meant something but did not mean what people who had not been there often assumed it meant. She had been leading a 6-person team. The IED had been placed under the 2nd section of a dry culvert crossing in a position that the route assessment had not flagged, because the route assessment had been done 48 hours earlier and the device had been placed in the 36 hours since. The blast had taken out the forward section of the team and had thrown Claire laterally into the culvert wall. She had been conscious for most of it, which was both fortunate and not fortunate in the specific way that conscious injury differs from unconscious injury. The right leg had taken the worst of it, the tibia shattered in 3 places, the knee joint damaged in ways that the surgeons in Germany would spend 3 hours trying to catalog. She had done an inventory of herself in the first 30 seconds, identified what was working and what was not. Concluded that the leg was not immediately life-threatening if she managed the bleeding, which she could. Concluded that the 2 members of her team who were also conscious and injured needed her functional more than they needed her distressed. And concluded with the particular clarity that certain extreme situations produce, the clarity that strips away everything that is not immediately relevant. That she had a job to do, and that doing it was the only thing that mattered right now. 73 hours. That was how long the evacuation took because the primary extraction route was compromised and the secondary required coordination that took time. She had spent those hours managing 3 things simultaneously, her own pain, which she treated as data, the condition of her two surviving teammates who needed medical management and needed to stay conscious and needed to be given reasons to stay engaged with the present moment, and the tactical picture, which she reconstructed from memory and updated as she could from their position, and which she transmitted to the extraction team when they finally made contact, and which rerouted them around an ambush position on the western approach that she had identified by reasoning backward from the pattern of device placement she had observed in the preceding weeks. 14 people came home through a corridor that would have been a kill zone. 3 of her team did not come home at all. She thought about that in the specific way that you think about things you cannot change, not trying to unmake them, not trying to justify them, just acknowledging their weight and continuing to carry it. She had learned over the years since that the weight did not get lighter. You got stronger. Or you didn't, and the weight won. She had decided in a hospital bed in Germany that she was not going to let it win. The leg the surgeons told her would not fully heal. There was structural damage that could be managed but not corrected. She would need to modify her activities. She would need to be realistic about what was possible. She had thanked them for their time and asked when physical therapy started. What she had understood in the 73 hours in that culvert and in the months of recovery that followed was something she had not been able to articulate clearly until she was well enough to think without pain management clouding the edges. Which was this: the thing that determines whether you survive a situation that is trying to kill you is not primarily physical. The body is remarkably capable of continuing to function under conditions that would theoretically preclude it. What determines survival is whether you can maintain the organizational structure of your own mind, whether you can keep sorting information into relevant and irrelevant, keep assigning the correct priority to the correct problem, keep choosing the next right action even when all the actions available are terrible. That was the skill. Everything else was in service of it. She had spent the 5 days since finding Marlowe on that concrete doing exactly what she had done in the culvert, maintaining the organizational structure, sorting information, choosing the next right action. The leg was what it was. The evidence was what it was. The timeline was what it was. She turned from the window and went back to work. On the 5th day, everything changed direction. She was crossing the main administrative building at 1100 hours when she passed Lieutenant Commander Aldrich in the corridor. He looked at her with the expression of a man delivering a message without words. Not hostile, almost pleasant. The expression of someone who wanted her to understand that he knew what she had been doing and that she should know he knew, and that the knowing was itself the message. She kept walking. But at 1400 that afternoon, a formal administrative notice arrived in her personnel file. Cadet Sylvie Marlowe had been referred to the Academic Integrity Board on a charge of examination fraud, specifically the unauthorized use of prohibited materials during a written assessment on February 24th. Claire read the notice once, then read it again. February 24th. She pulled the Academy's academic calendar. A Monday. She cross-referenced the first-year assessment schedule. The examination in question was a strategic analysis assessment administered in the main lecture hall from 900 to 1100. She then pulled the proctoring logs. Standard procedure: 2 faculty proctors, sign-in sheets, assigned seating. Marlowe's name was on the sign-in sheet. Seat assignment, 3rd row center section. The proctoring logs showed something else. The prohibited materials cited were described as handwritten notes found in Marlowe's possession at the examination site. The proctor who had logged the discovery was Lieutenant Commander Aldrich, listed as secondary proctor for the February 24th assessment. Aldrich had not been on the original examination schedule. His name had been added to the proctoring log in an amendment filed March 7th, 4 days after the corridor incident with Marlowe, and the same day the complaint form had been torn in half and returned to her. The notes that Aldrich claimed to have found on February 24th had been logged as evidence on March 8th, 2 weeks after the examination, the day after Marlowe had been found outside the gate. The timeline was not an anomaly. The timeline was a construction. Someone had decided that a withdrawn complaint was not sufficient containment and had reached for a heavier instrument. Claire sat with this for exactly the amount of time she could afford to sit with it, which was not long, because the Academic Integrity Board had a mandatory hearing timeline of 48 hours from referral, and Marlowe's hearing was now scheduled for the day after tomorrow. The evidence was close. It was the most compelling partial case she had assembled in this amount of time, and it was not yet complete. The corroboration was thin in 2 places. Thorne had not committed to anything. The camera footage proved Gault's presence in a corridor. It needed a second layer to make it resistant to alternative explanation. She needed more time. She did not have more time. She thought about going to the Academic Integrity Board now tonight and laying out everything she had. She thought about what Gault would do with that. An instructor operating outside her posting, bringing an incomplete case against the Academy commandant in order to derail a proceeding. She could see precisely and clearly how that ended. Not just for her, for everyone whose name was on Firth's drive. She sat at her desk in the curriculum review office for a long time with the afternoon light moving across the floor and the sounds of the academy going on around her. And she ran the calculation the way she had been trained to run it, not emotionally, not in the way that produces the answer you want, but in the way that produces the answer that is accurate. The case presented tonight with what she had would be challenged and delayed and managed. Gault had 3 years of practice at managing things. He would produce alternative explanations for the footage, dispute the chain of custody on the drive characterized as Firth's statement as the confused testimony of a seriously ill old man with a personal grievance. He would not win. In the end, the evidence was too substantial for that, but he would buy time. And in that time, the larger case would fracture, and Hale and Thorne and the others would see what happened when you came forward incomplete and would close whatever doors had been cracking open. Marlowe would be cleared eventually. But eventually was not the same as now, and everyone else would remain buried. She made the decision she would carry the weight of for a long time afterward. She did not go to the board. Marlowe's hearing proceeded. Claire was not present. At 1600, the result came through temporary academic suspension pending full investigation. Barred from classes and training. Not expelled. Not yet. But removed. Claire closed the administrative window on her screen and sat back and looked at the ceiling. She had done the calculation correctly. Using incomplete evidence at the wrong moment would have destroyed the larger case and left every previous victim, Marlowe and Breck and Hale and Thorne, and every name she didn't yet have, without recourse. She knew that. She had made the right call by any strategic measure she knew how to apply. It felt like nothing that could accurately be called right. She thought about the 48 hours she had waited while the board ruled, about the choice she had made and whether she would make it again knowing the cost. The answer was yes, which made it no easier to sit with. There is a specific kind of weight that comes from being right in a way that costs someone else something. It is different from the weight of being wrong, heavier in some ways because it does not come with the comfort of self-justification. You cannot tell yourself you made an error. You made the correct decision and someone else paid the price of it, and you have to find a way to carry that without letting it undo you. Because if it undoes you, then the decision was wasted and the price was paid for nothing. She had been taught in the specific school of experience that had produced her that the right decision is not the same as the comfortable one and that the difference between them is usually paid in something you cannot get back. She let herself sit with that for 90 seconds. Then she went to find Desmond Firth. She found him in the equipment room. He was sitting at the workbench with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the middle distance. And when she came in and closed the door, he did not look surprised and did not ask how the hearing had gone because he already knew. "I need everything you have," she said. "Not just what's on the drive. Everything you remember, everything you observed, every conversation you had in November of 2017 that you can still account for. I need it in the form of a written statement, signed and dated, and I need it notarized by someone outside this institution." Firth looked at her. "When tonight?" He nodded once without hesitation with the quality of a man who has been waiting a long time to be asked to do something he already knew he needed to do. "Thorne," Claire said, "have you spoken to her twice, last year? She wasn't ready. She might be closer than she was. I need you to reach out to her. Not me, she's already been seen with me, and Gault's people are watching. You're still below his radar. That changes the moment I file anything. I know, which is why I'm asking you to reach out first and file second." She paused. "Can you do that?" Firth looked at her for a moment with something that might on a different face have been amusement. "Lieutenant," he said, "I have 6 months. What exactly do you think I can't afford?" She looked at him. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what it's worth." "It's worth something," he said. "Not as much as getting this right." He picked up a pen from the workbench. "I'll start writing." She left him there and walked back through the west corridor. She was 2 doors from the equipment room when she heard footsteps behind her. Deliberate, paced to match hers. She turned. Geraldine Thorne was standing in the corridor in civilian clothes off duty. Her expression was the carefully controlled one Claire had seen in the gym, but something had shifted in it, something in the direction of decision. "The 2 names," Thorne said, "from the room where the decision was made. In 2017. She paused. If I give them to you and you use them and Gault finds out before you're ready, he won't come after me the way he came after Marlowe." "No," Claire agreed. "He'll be more careful than that." So, that's what I thought. Thorne was quiet for a moment. "My father served 22 years. He used to say that the worst thing you can do in a broken system is pretend it isn't broken, because then you own the breakage." Claire waited. "Lieutenant Commander Aldrich," Thorne said, "and a captain named Sievert, who retired in 2018. Those are the two names." She looked directly at Claire. "I'm not ready to give a formal statement, but I'm telling you now on my own terms so that you know the shape of what you're looking at." "Thank you," Claire said. Thorne nodded. "Don't waste it," she said, and walked back the way she had come. Claire stood alone in the corridor. The shape of what she was looking at was clear. Gault at the center, Aldrich as the instrument, Sievert as the witness who had been quietly retired. A system of compliance built on the calculated understanding that most people will absorb a certain amount of injustice rather than risk becoming its next subject. Most people. She had 40 hours until she would have enough to take this to the Naval Inspector General's office, bypassing every institutional layer that Gault had spent 3 years carefully managing. 40 hours if Firth's statement was completed tonight. She was 2/3 of the way through assembling something that could not be dismissed. Then the following morning, Admiral Warren Gault called her office at 08:15 and left a message with the curriculum review administrator that Lieutenant Claire Merritt was expected in the commandant's office at 1100 for what the message described as a routine personnel review. She spent the 2 hours and 40 minutes between receiving that message and walking into his office doing 3 things. She sent Firth a single-word message tonight. She made a secure backup of every piece of evidence she had assembled and sent it to a location outside the institution. And she went to the equipment room one last time to pick up the completed and witnessed statement that Firth had worked through the night to finish 11 pages handwritten, signed on every page, with a notary seal from a retired JAG officer who lived 12 minutes from the academy and who Firth had called at midnight with the authority of a man calling in the only favor he had ever asked for in 31 years of service. She put it in the inside pocket of her uniform jacket. Then she walked to the commandant's office. The academy was bright and cold around her March light, sharp and precise, cutting across the quad at a low angle and throwing long shadows from the buildings. Cadets moved in every direction. Flags moved in the offshore wind. Her right leg moved through its negotiation with each stride the way it always did, the way it had since Kandahar. Not a limitation, not a reminder, just the shape of the distance between where she had been and where she was going. She had built the case as completely as she could in the time she had. She had not yet been able to use it, and in approximately 40 minutes she was going to walk into the office of a man who had been quietly destroying careers and suppressing the truth of a 20-year-old boy's death, and he was going to give her the opportunity she had been waiting for. Not the opportunities she had planned for, but the kind that comes when a man who has operated without consequence for long enough begins to mistake impunity for invincibility. She had seen this before, in men who were genuinely capable, genuinely accomplished, and who had let the absence of resistance convince them that they were simply correct, that the ground beneath their feet was solid because no one had yet demonstrated otherwise. The ground in Claire's experience was very rarely as solid as it appeared. She reached the commandant's building, straightened her jacket, felt the weight of Firth's statement against her chest. She thought for a moment about Kandahar. Not the explosion. She rarely thought about that directly in the way that the body's self-preservation instincts tend to place certain memories behind glass, accessible but not fully inhabitable. She thought about the 73 hours that came after it, the particular quality of those hours which she had never been able to fully describe to anyone who hadn't spent time in a similar kind of waiting. The way time moves differently when your body is badly hurt and your situation is uncertain, and the only thing you can actually do is manage your own mind well enough to stay useful until help arrives. She had done 3 things during those 73 hours. She had managed her pain by treating it as data rather than experience. She had mapped the area around her position from memory, cataloging every approach route and egress point she could reconstruct from the patrol intel she had absorbed before they'd gone out. And she had talked to the 2 men in her unit who were also injured, not about their situation, not about the odds, but about anything else. Their families, their hometowns. The specific and detailed arguments they had with each other about baseball, which both of them cared about and which she did not but was perfectly willing to adjudicate. The information she had mapped from memory when she finally reached the evacuation team had rerouted them around an ambush position she had identified on the western approach. 14 people had come home from a corridor that would otherwise have been a kill zone. The leg had not come home the same way it had gone in, but she had come home. and the 14 people had come home. That was the math. She opened the door and went in. The commandant's office occupied the northeast corner of the administrative building on the third floor, with windows that faced the quad on one side and the open water on the other. On a clear day, you could see the bay from where Admiral Gault's desk sat gray and vast and indifferent, the kind of view that powerful men tend to arrange for themselves because there is something in the human appetite for authority that requires a horizon. Claire had been in this office twice before. Once during her initial assignment briefing 3 years ago when Gault had been cordial and precise and had shaken her hand with exactly the right amount of pressure. Once 18 months ago when he had commended her training program, results in front of 4 senior officers with the particular warmth of a man who understood that visible generosity towards subordinates costs nothing and purchases considerable goodwill. She had found him impressive on both occasions in the way that certain kinds of dangerous things are impressive, not because they are good, but because they are extremely good at what they do. The anteroom outside his office held 2 chairs and a desk where his administrative aide sat with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had learned not to register anything that happened in proximity to this office. He told Claire the Admiral would be with her shortly and offered her coffee, which she declined. She sat in one of the chairs and waited with her hands in her lap and her breathing steady and her mind arranged around the shape of what was about to happen. She waited 11 minutes, not 10, not 15, 11 long enough to communicate that her time was not the priority here, short enough that she could not reasonably object. Then the aide opened the inner door and gestured her through. Gault was standing behind his desk when she entered. Not sitting standing, which was a choice. A man who sits when a subordinate enters demonstrates comfort. A man who stands demonstrates that the subordinate has arrived into his space on his terms. He was in full dress uniform, silver hair precisely cut. The gray water was visible through the window behind him. There were 11 other people in the room. She noted that without allowing it to alter anything in her face or posture. 2 of Gault's personal aides, 3 senior officers from the Academy's command staff, 2 enlisted men positioned near the door in a way that was not quite standing at attention, and 4 individuals in civilian clothes whose presence she processed and filed in the half-second before she directed her full attention to Gault. He had brought witnesses. His own witnesses in his own space. This was not a personnel review. This was a stage, and he had set it, and she had walked onto it. She stood in the center of the room and looked at him steadily, and she did not say anything. The room was very quiet. Outside the windows, the Academy went about its business, cadets crossing the quad flags in the wind, the muted sounds of an institution in its daily operation. None of it reached this room. This room existed in a separate atmosphere, sealed by the specific weight of what was about to happen. Lieutenant Merritt, Gault said. His voice was exactly what it always was, measured, complete, without inflection that could be characterized as anything other than professional. Thank you for coming. Admiral, she said. He moved around the desk, not quickly, with the unhurried pace of someone who has nowhere to be. He picked up a single sheet of paper from the desk surface and held it loosely. You've been in the curriculum review division for 5 days, he said. I've been reviewing your service record, and I want to offer you a pathway that respects your contributions while acknowledging the reality of your current situation. He held out the paper. Transfer request, voluntary, medical grounds, her name already printed at the top, signature line blank. I'm not going to sign that, she said. The room was very quiet. What she did not know in that moment, and would not learn until the Inspector General's investigation produced Gault's internal communications 3 weeks later, was that at 07:52 that morning, Gault had received word that the IG portal had logged a priority review submission. He had spent the 3 hours between that notification and her arrival attempting to identify the source and had failed. By the time she walked through his door, he was not operating from his customary controlled authority. He was operating from something older and less disciplined, the fear of a man who has never learned to manage it and who had no practice at all with the sensation of the ground shifting beneath him. Fear in men like that tends to express itself as force. Admiral, she said, I know what you did in November of 2017. The room did not move. Not one person in it moved, not the aides, not the command step, not the 2 men near the door. The silence was the silence of a space that has just been rearranged by something that cannot be taken back. Gault's expression did not break immediately. Men who have operated this long without consequence develop a reliable surface. But his jaw shifted minutely and his hands came out from behind his back, and she watched him make the decision she had known, on some level, he was always going to make. His right hand moved. She had been waiting for it for 5 days. Her body did not need instruction. Her right side turned inward as his arm extended, and she caught his wrist at the apex of the arc, 2 fingers and a thumb, the exact grip that redirects momentum without requiring strength to overcome it. And she turned her hips and let his own force carry him. And Admiral Warren Gault, commandant of the United States Naval Academy, went to the floor of his own office with a sound that was mostly surprise. 1.5 seconds, perhaps less. She held her position, grounded, balanced, weight slightly forward, hands open, and she looked at each of the 11 people in the room in the 2 seconds that followed, and she assessed, and she let the room decide what it was going to do. It decided to remain still. Gault pushed himself to one knee. He pointed at the 2 men near the door. "Detain her," he said. Neither man moved. She looked at them. They were both looking at something to her left. She followed their eyes and found Lieutenant Commander Aldrich standing near the window. He was looking at his phone. His face had gone the color of old concrete. One of the 4 civilians stepped forward. A woman in her 50s, gray-suited with the bearing of someone who operated in institutional spaces where authority was not performed, but assumed. She produced a credential case. "Admiral Gault," she said, "I'm Deputy Inspector General Carla Fenn, Naval Inspector General's office. We've been made aware of materials filed this morning through the IG hotline." She looked at Gault on the floor, then at Claire with an expression that was not sympathy but something adjacent to recognition. "I need everyone in this room to remain present." Gault got to his feet. He straightened his jacket with the automatic reflex of a man whose grooming had become entirely unconscious. He looked at Fenn, and for the first time in the 3 years that Claire had known him, by reputation and proximity, he looked like a man who understood that the ground had changed. "This is," he began. "Sir," Fenn said with a politeness that had iron in it, "I'd ask you to wait." He waited. What had happened that morning was this. Desmond Firth had completed his written statement at 0230. 11 pages handwritten on standard Academy stationery, signed on every page, notarized at 0700. He had then filed it through the Naval Inspector General's secure submission portal at 0745 with a cover letter summarizing the attached evidence and requesting immediate review. What Firth had not known, what nobody outside the IG's office knew, was that an anonymous complaint filed 14 months earlier by a retired officer had already opened a preliminary inquiry into the Academy. That inquiry had stalled for lack of documentary evidence. Firth's submission had not created the case. It had completed one that had been waiting. Fenn had not driven from Washington in 2 hours. She had been in Annapolis since the previous afternoon, staying 4 blocks from the Academy gate, waiting for something her office had understood was coming, without knowing exactly when. The timing was not luck. It was patience meeting preparation at the right moment. The next 4 hours were procedural and thorough, and moved with the patience of a process that does not need to hurry, because the evidence has already been submitted and a federal timestamp cannot be altered after the fact. Fenn's team moved through the commandant's office and adjacent administrative spaces with systematic attention. Devices were secured, files were requested, personnel were interviewed individually in a conference room down the hall in order of their proximity to the events in question. Claire gave her statement in the 2nd hour. She sat across from a younger investigator named Marsh, who was thorough and precise, and whose questions told her he had already read Firth's submission carefully and was now building the corroborative architecture around it. She answered every question directly without elaboration or omission, and she produced the flash drive and the backed-up camera footage and the proctoring log discrepancy and the timeline analysis of the academic integrity referral, each item placed on the table in the order it had been assembled. Marsh looked at the materials with the expression of someone confirming something rather than discovering it. "The footage," he said, "you made 3 copies." "Yes." "Chain of custody." She walked him through it. "He wrote for a while. Then you've been building this for 5 days." "Yes." "Alone." She thought about Firth in the equipment room at 0230, about Thorne in the corridor giving 2 names on her own terms, about Hale in Virginia saying yes with 1 word because 1 word was all he could give and all she had asked for. "No," she said, "not alone." Marsh nodded. 4 more questions. Then he thanked her, and she was escorted to a waiting area where she sat in a chair against the wall and watched the afternoon light move across the floor while the process continued around her. Gault was escorted from the building at 1630. Not in restraints, not yet. He walked with Fenn on one side and a legal representative on the other in his uniform, his hair still precisely cut. The command staff who had been in his office that morning were assembled near the exit, and not one of them spoke as he passed. Claire was standing at the end of the corridor. She was there because she had needed to be somewhere, and this was where she had ended up, and she did not plan what happened as Gault reached the point in the corridor where he could not avoid seeing her. He stopped. His legal representative put a hand on his arm, and he did not respond to it. He looked at Claire with the expression of a man sorting through several possible things to say and finding none of them adequate. What he said was, "You had no idea what you were dismantling." She looked at him steadily. "I knew exactly what I was dismantling," she said. "That was the point." He looked at her for another moment, and then something happened in his face that she had not expected. Not anger, not defiance, but a brief and unguarded exhaustion, the kind that surfaces in men who have been maintaining something for a very long time and have suddenly been relieved of the obligation. It lasted 2 seconds before his expression closed again. Then he walked out. She stood in the corridor for a while after the door closed in the specific stillness that follows the end of something that has taken everything you have to finish. She had expected to feel something definitive, completion, or vindication, or the relief of a weight lifted. What she felt was more complicated, a mixture that didn't resolve cleanly, something that recognized the gist of what had been built and who had paid it and whether the accounting would ever fully balance. She thought about the word Gault had used, dismantling, as if what she had done was destructive rather than corrective, as if the things she had taken apart had been something worth preserving. She had known men like him before. Not many, most people, even the difficult ones, do not achieve this particular combination of capability and damage, but enough to recognize the architecture. The way the external precision conceals something that is not precision at all, but rather the absence of any meaningful internal check. The way authority, when it operates long enough without consequence, stops feeling like a responsibility and starts feeling like a property right. The way that shift, once it has happened, is essentially invisible to the person it happens to. She did not believe Gault had set out to become what he had become. She believed he had made a series of decisions, each one individually justifiable, each one moving him incrementally further from the man he had probably intended to be, until the distance between intention and reality was so great that the only way to maintain the self-image was to stop looking at the reality directly. That was the mechanism. That was how these things became systems rather than incidents. Not malice usually, though malice was sometimes present. More often accumulated small decisions, accumulated small silences. The institutional equivalent of deferred maintenance, invisible until the structure fails. She had not dismantled anything that should have stood. She had revealed what had already fallen. Whether the accounting would ever fully balance, she didn't know. Probably not. It rarely did. But it was moving toward balance now, which was more than it had been a week ago, and more than it would have been if she had looked at Marlowe on that concrete and kept running. Marlowe's suspension was formally vacated the following morning. The Academic Integrity Board convened an emergency review at 800, presented with the IG's preliminary findings regarding the proctoring log amendment and the timestamp discrepancy, and issued a full reversal within 40 minutes. The fabricated charge was withdrawn. The board's chair issued a written statement that used the phrase procedural irregularities 7 times in 4 paragraphs, which Claire recognized as institutional language for, "We understand what happened here and we are carefully not saying it directly." She was outside the administrative building when Marlowe came out at 09:30. The girl stopped when she saw her. She looked different than she had 5 days ago on the cold concrete. Not lighter exactly, certain things do not simply lift when the immediate pressure is removed. But her posture had changed. She was standing at her full height in a way that she had not been outside the gate. "It's done," Marlowe said. "The suspension is vacated. There will be a full IG investigation. That takes time, but the record is clear." Marlowe was quiet. "The other ones, before me, being reviewed, all of them. And Breck." Claire looked at her. "How do you know about Breck?" "People talk," Marlowe said. "Cadets hear more than people think." She paused. "Is his mother going to know what really happened?" "Yes, she's going to know." Marlowe nodded slowly. She looked at the quad, the morning light on the buildings, the flags in the offshore wind. "What happens to the academy?" "The academy continues," Claire said. "Programs continue. The people who kept their heads down and did their jobs well continue doing them. That's how institutions survive, not because they were never broken, but because enough people inside them were doing the right thing when it mattered. And the ones who weren't, the process handles that. That's what the process is for." Marlowe looked at her for a long moment. "You didn't sleep much this week." "No." "Does it get easier knowing you made the right call, but someone still got hurt because of the timing?" Claire thought about the 48 hours she had held the evidence, about the calculation and the cost, and whether she would make the same call again. "No," she said. "It doesn't get easier. You get better at carrying it." Marlowe absorbed this without flinching, which told Claire something about the kind of officer she was going to become. "Go get some breakfast," Claire said. "You look like you haven't eaten." Marlowe almost smiled. Yes, ma'am, she said and walked across the quad in the March morning light. She wrote to Mrs. Breck the following week. Not an official communication, she had no standing for that, and the JAG office was handling the formal channels. This was a personal letter, 2 pages handwritten on plain paper. She told her about Firth, about a man who had sat in her kitchen and carried the truth of what happened for 2 years and had finally set it down the only way he knew how. She told her that Thomas had been remembered specifically and by name in the statement that had started everything, that his name was in a federal filing, that it was not going away. She did not ask for a response. 3 weeks later, one arrived, a single card, 6 words in a careful hand. He would have liked her very much. She kept it in the same jacket pocket where she had kept the torn complaint form and the medal that Firth had pressed into her palm in the hospital, because some things belong together. The call came from Desmond Firth's doctor on a Tuesday in May. Claire was in the training compound when her personal phone vibrated. She had taken her position back after the IG's preliminary findings had rendered the reassignment order inoperative. She was working with third-year cadets 3 weeks from their operational placement assessments. She finished the session. She always finished the session. She drove to the hospital in under 20 minutes. He was still there when she arrived, conscious, which was more than she had allowed herself to hope for. His eyes were the same as they had always been, clear and level, and measuring the eyes of a man who had spent his entire life in environments where accurate assessment was the difference between surviving and not. She sat in the chair beside the bed and said nothing for a while, because there was nothing that needed to be said yet, and he had always preferred accurate silence to inaccurate words. The room had the quality that hospital rooms have in the late afternoon, a stillness that is not peaceful exactly, but that has stopped pretending to be anything other than what it is. The light came through the window at a low angle, a cup of water on the bedside table that no one had touched, a card propped against it that she had not sent because she had not known what to write that was both true and useful, and she had decided that arriving was more truthful than any card. He looked the way people look when something that was held very tightly for a very long time has finally been put down. Not diminished, Desmond Firth was not a man you could accurately describe as diminished by anything, but reduced to his essential self in the way that serious illness tends to produce the surface competencies stripped away to the man underneath them. She had known him for 3 years, and she was not certain she had ever fully seen him until now. Back in class, she said, scored highest in her cohort on the March tactical assessment. Something moved in his face. Good, he said. The IG completed the preliminary report last week, she said. Gault is facing formal charges. Aldrich resigned. Sievert's retirement is under review. The Breck family has been contacted by the Judge Advocate General's office. He was quiet. He looked at the ceiling. Outside the window, May in Maryland was doing what May in Maryland does, bright and green and indifferent to the specific weight of specific rooms. His mother, he said, Mrs. Breck. I spoke to her myself, Claire said, on the phone and then in person. She paused. She said she always knew, that mothers always know when they're being told the managed version of a thing rather than the true version. She said she was glad someone had finally said it plainly. Firth closed his eyes. A long, slow exhalation, not grief exactly, but the exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for 2 years and has finally been permitted to stop. I should have said it plainly in 2017, he said. Yes, Claire said, and you didn't. And then you spent 18 months building something that made it possible to say it now in a way that it couldn't be ignored or buried. That's not absolution, but it's not nothing. He looked at her. You're harder on yourself than that. I held the evidence for 48 hours while Marlowe took the suspension. Because you needed the timing. Because I needed the timing, she agreed. That doesn't make it not a cost. He was quiet for a while. The monitor beside the bed maintained its steady rhythm. The first time I ran after Kandahar, she said, was 19 days after the surgery. The physical therapist told me I was at least 6 weeks from any weight-bearing activity. I got up at 400 and walked to the end of the ward and back. The next morning, I walked twice that distance. She looked at her right leg. The leg never healed the way it was supposed to. There are things it won't do, and I've stopped expecting it to do them. But it carries me where I need to go. Firth looked at her for a long time. Iron does not bend, he said. No, she said. It endures. Yes. He reached into the narrow drawer of the bedside table with the deliberateness of a man managing significant pain, and he produced a service medal. Naval Commendation. His name on the back and a date from 1984, the year after Beirut. She took it from his hand. I don't want it buried with me, he said. I want it used. Put it somewhere it means something. I will, she said. He died that afternoon at 1547 with the Maylight coming through the window. Claire was in the corridor when it happened. She had stepped out to give him the quiet he had needed, and she stood against the wall with the metal in her hand and let the weight of it settle into her. Not grief exactly, or not only that, something larger, the weight of all the people whose names were attached to this one small piece of metal. Breck and his mother in Ohio, Marlowe on the cold concrete, Hale in Virginia saying yes, Thorne in the corridor giving two names on her own terms, and Firth himself deciding at last that the silence was finished. Iron does not bend, it endures, and sometimes it carries the weight of those who couldn't hold on. She stood in the corridor and let herself have that for the time it needed. Then she walked toward the exit, and the May afternoon received her. Deputy I.G. Fenn came to find her 2 mornings later in the equipment room at 06:15. Fenn sat on the workbench with the ease of a woman who had been in enough rooms to know that formality is not always the correct instrument. She looked around the equipment room with the expression of someone who understood why a person would be here at this hour. "The preliminary report is complete," she said. "Formal charges against Gault and Aldrich go to the Secretary of the Navy's office next week. The Breck family has engaged JAG counsel. The 5 prior complainants are being offered formal reinstatement reviews." She paused. "The IG's office would like to formally recognize your role in no," Claire said. Fenn looked at her. "Firth filed the submission," Claire said. "Marlowe filed the original complaint. Thorne identified the additional witnesses. I assembled what was there to assemble." She paused. "The recognition belongs to the people who paid the highest price, not me." Fenn looked at her for a long moment, recalibrating something. "There's a promotion review pending," she said. "Your name is on it. Commander's track." Claire looked at her steadily. "I'd like to withdraw from that review. Lieutenant, I want to stay here," she said, "in this posting. Teaching." She looked at the equipment room, the racks of gear, the worn floor, the window that looked onto the track where the morning light was just beginning to come in. "This is where the work gets done. The other thing is," she considered the word, "elsewhere." Fenn was quiet for a while. Then she said simply, "All right." After Fenn left, Claire stood at the window for a moment. A single figure was running the early circuit on the track, a first-year cadet, a woman pushing through the last quarter mile with the determination of someone learning what their body is capable of. Claire watched for a moment, then she picked up her bag and went outside. The academy was waking up around her, the sounds of an institution resuming its forward motion, as institutions do as they must, the machinery of preparation and formation of the kind of people a country requires in its harder moments. Continuing because continuity is what institutions are for, even when they are broken, even when they require fixing, even when the cost of the fixing is paid by people who do it without asking for recognition. She reached the track at 5:45. The cadet who had been running was coming around the final curve, and as she slowed to a stop, she looked up and saw Claire, and something in her expression resolved into a kind of recognition that did not require explanation. Sylvie Marlowe was breathing hard. Her uniform was dark with exertion. She had the look of a person who had been out here long enough to find something in the running that she hadn't had before. She fell into step beside Claire without being asked. They ran. May in Annapolis was warmer than March, the water running blue in the distance, when the angle was right, the air carrying the particular quality of a season that has finally committed to being itself. Claire ran the way she always ran, not despite the leg, not around it, but with it, the way you carry anything that has become part of you. Not a limitation, not a reminder, just the shape of the distance between where she had been and where she was going. They ran the first mile without speaking, then the second. Then Marlowe said without looking over, "I heard about Master Chief Firth." "Yes," Claire said. "I never got to thank him." "He knew," Claire said. "He wasn't doing it for the thanks." They ran on. The sun was clearing the buildings now, the light going gold and horizontal across the quad, catching the flags and the windows and the long shadows of the early morning. Cadets were emerging in ones and twos, the academy pulling itself into its daily shape. "What was he like?" Marlowe asked. "Before all this?" Claire thought about it, about the equipment room and the inventory and the calloused hands and the eyes that had been carrying something heavy for 2 years and had set it down at last. About an 11-page statement written by hand in the middle of the night by a man who understood that some things cannot wait for a convenient moment. He was the kind of person, she said, who understood that doing the right thing later is not the same as doing the right thing, and who never stopped paying the difference. Marlowe was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I want to be that." Claire looked at the track ahead of them, the long curve, the morning light, the distance still to go. The medal was in her jacket pocket against her chest, warm from the body heat of a person who had carried harder things across harder ground and had not yet stopped moving forward. Desmond Firth had walked out of Beirut in October of 1983, carrying the weight of 141 men who had not. He had carried it for 36 years. He had set it down the only way he knew how, by picking up something heavier and carrying that instead all the way to the end. Thomas Breck had been 20 years old and had died in a building that was not equipped to save him, and his mother had a photograph on her kitchen table and had waited 2 years for someone to say the thing plainly. Sylvie Marlowe had sat on cold concrete at 5:47 in the morning, holding the torn halves of something that deserved to be whole. And somewhere in a federal filing with a timestamp that could not be altered, all of their names were on record. Not going anywhere. Not manageable. Not buried. Then run, Claire said. They ran. Iron does not bend. It endures. And sometimes in the early morning light of a May that follows the longest winter, it finds that it has carried the weight of those who couldn't hold on all the way to somewhere worth arriving.